Good evening, everyone. Boa noite. Welcome back to our series, Brazil, 200 Years of Independence, History, Language and Culture. My name is Marco. I teach Portuguese. I'm lecturer at the Barbados Language Centre, Barbados Community College. Welcome to this new session, this live session. Today, I have here with me Dr. Elaine Rocha. She will speak about the steps that led to the independence of Brazil. The title is Brazil, the Path to Independence. Dr. Rocha is Brazilian. She was born in São Paulo. She has lived in different parts of Brazil and also the world. She has lived, for example, in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Ethiopia, obviously. Now she lives in Barbados. She has a major in history at the University of Taubaté in Brazil. She has a master's from the University of Pretoria in cultural history, and she has a PhD from the University of São Paulo in social history. Dr. Rocha, welcome. And I will give over to you. So I hope that we will learn a few things in history that led to the independence of Brazil. So over to you, you can share. And as usual, people can ask questions later or make comments at the end. But first, we will have Dr. Rocha's presentation. Welcome.
My turn to speak? Okay. Thank you. Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me here. It is a pleasure and an honor to work with Marco and the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown in celebrating 200 years of independence, Brazilian independence. I am going to share with you my screen. And what I'm going to try to do here is basically to summarize 300 years of history in 40 minutes or less. So, back up, and I will start our conversation now. Marco,
Sorry, Dr. Rocha. I forgot actually to say, yes, you already mentioned this. So this series is obviously hosted by the Embassy of Brazil in Bridgetown and the Barbados Community College, right? So I should say that as well. Sorry for interrupting.
No problem. So let's start. Here it is. Okay, the path to independence of Brazil. Brazilian independence, for those who are Caribbean or from Barbados, is very different because Brazil becomes independent in 1822, but actually Brazil was not a colony since 1808. We are going to discuss that. But also from other Latin American countries, especially the continental Latin American countries, Brazilian independence is different because it did not involve a major war or years of war like Mexico, Peru, even Argentina, which went to years and years of war. The third thing that is different is that Brazil is the only colony of continental Americas that did not break up. Let's say mostly from Latin America did not break up after independence. It continued and actually expanded its territory. So that is another difference. And we're not going to talk about this today, but after independence, Brazil becomes the only empire in the Americas. So let's start to see how that thing was the beginning of this. So That's the major question that many people ask me. Why is Brazil is the largest? Is Brazil the largest country in Latin America? And what are the factors that contributed for this? Well, first, Portuguese expedition with support internal, I mean territorial expeditions inland that had support of indigenous people, also attacked indigenous people, and that contributed to the expansion of territories because some people were allies and some people were defeated by the Portuguese, and by this way they kept going. That's one thing. So they managed to go beyond the Tordesillas line. Portugal and Spain also were united as one government for about 60 years. That also contributed for facilitated the borders to be, just forget about the borders. We cross one way or another way. We are also going to talk about this a little bit more. Miscegenation was a very important part of the political plan to control that large territory. The Portuguese Empire in South America managed not to break up after independence. The last thing is that the embracing of a Brazilian nationality, which united every person born in the territory. And that is also a political project that was taken over still in the 19th century. But it had started during the colonial period. So let's start the conversation. Many of you learned in primary or secondary school about the line of Tordesillas, which divided the world in two parts, one part for Portugal, one part for Spain. According to that agreement, this is the part that should be the Portuguese colony in the Americas, and that is all. Nothing more than that, but different. This is the line that nobody respected right away. It was created and disrespected right away because other countries not involved in the treaty, they said, well, there is no testament of God giving the land to the Pope, and the Pope doesn't have the right to share. Anyway, those countries use the norm, the Roman law, that you may continue to possess as you possess. So if you take it, it's yours. More or less this. It says, uti possidetis ita possideatis. Something like that. Not good in Latin. Well, the principle enables a nation to claim occupied territory that they occupy, even if by war or invasion. But if they are already there, they have settlements there, they can consider their land theirs. Not talking about the indigenous people. We're not talking about the indigenous people. Once they dominate, it's theirs. Well, in that case, the government of Portugal created the norm to colonize Brazil, a rule that every person that receives land in Brazil had to expand towards the center of the continent, a number of miles per year, or they were going to lose their rights to that land. Apart from that, they were also supporting expeditions. This is an image of expeditions that would go and use all these veins here. Blue veins are rivers. And there are much more than this. These are the biggest rivers. But we have millions of rivers in Brazil. And those rivers were the routes to explore the continent. So many of those expeditions used those rivers, and of course they also walked and go up and down the mountains to explore and see what they were finding. Especially after news, this is around here, you have Peru and Bolivia, and the news of gold and silver found in that area arrived in Portugal because, of course, Spain was bringing everything to Europe. And so they understanding that this is one continent and uh, they were in the eastern coast, they should explore and try to go west to see if they would find more of this, some of these treasures. It took longer, but they did find. This is the type of people that were exploring Brazil in the 16th and 17th century. So there were classes of people that, sorry, that would go even without shoes, people that have barely sandals, and some people that were richer, of course, they have more money, and they have proper guns and ammunition and proper dressing and boots and everything. You see, the other some of them doesn't only have this kind of firearm. So it was not everybody the same, but also since the miscegenation started from day one, the children of those men with indigenous women was also incorporated to those expeditions because they could speak the local language, and they were like a bridge between Portuguese and the local. So was not only white people doing this exploitation, but at this point, what we call a caboclo in Brazil, which is somebody mixed with indigenous and Portuguese. This is a nation of mixed people from day one, from the beginning, actually from before the day one, because when in 1500, when Cabral arrived in Brazil, he already found some people that were cast away by storms, surviving shipwrecks that were in Brazil, and over there they established families. So even before there was the idea of Brazil, there was already mixed people. In Brazil, as much as in other Portuguese territories occupied in other continents, mixing with locals were part of the strategy to control the land, because that created, once there is a marriage between the Portuguese colonizer and the local, there is this idea of parenting or becoming relative, becoming the same family. So instantly, the extended family of the spouse, the local spouse, becomes their allies in case of war, for example. So that was a very common strategy. And the government of Portugal not only accepted, but they gave prizes. Sometimes they awarded titles to somebody that has this kind of arrangement, or get married, or bring this large family to the side of the Portuguese. The vast majority of Portuguese arriving in Brazil, especially during the first 2 centuries of colonization, were male. So marrying indigenous women was encouraged and necessary. African slaves started to arrive in 1540. Indigenous people were also enslaved. So it's not that it's a substitution. Many people think that the African people came to substitute the indigenous people, and that is not true. Indigenous people continue to be enslaved, and when the legislation forbade them to be enslaved officially, they still being enslaved when they were captured, but they could not, the difference was that they could not be sold, and the second generation is free. Well, in that case, the Africans that were imported to Brazil also were, in the majority of them were male. You have more male than female. And you also have the rate of death among female slaves because of pregnancy and other complications. So what happens is that those indigenous people enslaved, many of them women captured in wars because the men died in the war. So you have lots of female and children that were captured. They wouldn't so mate, they would form couples, or they would have children not only with the Portuguese, but also with the Africans. So that miscegenation goes on and on. And also you have to understand that indigenous person can have a relationship with a mixed one, or a black with the mixed one. And so you can miscegenation every way possible. So that was created a population that was mixed from starting, and because they needed some people to create this organization, administrative organization, they used those mixed people to help in administration for intermediate posts. Portuguese settlers learned from indigenous and African people how to explore and how to control the land. So those who were enslaved or those who were allies, they actually teach them, the hammock come from the indigenous. They use indigenous people. The use of cassava comes from indigenous people. Different types of corn, also African people also teach them a lot. And you're going to see that very important for mining production. So the colonial economy that many people claim to be that triangular commerce in which the colony cannot produce anything like industry, that is not true, because distance and the size of a country like Brazil, it prevented every person to import everything from Portugal. It took months to arrive something from Portugal to the shores, but from the shores to the center of the continent, to the interior of Brazil, was even worse. Around 1590, colonial authorities reported to Portugal that they found iron in the region of São Paulo. This is the map. São Paulo is here in the southeast. And who found that was West African slaves, because the area of Benin and Ghana, that region, they are experts in minerals. They know how to work with iron, but also gold as well. So they started, some of these slaves could see there was iron, and they made an agreement with his owner. He got his freedom, and he's going to show him where was the mine, and start the exploration. Besides the Portuguese knowledge of metallurgy, because they knew about that, Europe knew about that, they acknowledged that the African production of iron was better, was superior. And African men from Western Africa started to be imported to identify mines and producing iron, and later on gold. That was very important. In 1590, the Portuguese administrator imported some people that have expertise in producing iron. What they did not say is that some of those people possibly were from Africa. The colonial industry of iron make it possible to produce knives, tools for agriculture, swords, horseshoes, nails, and so it didn't need to import everything. The following centuries, they continued to produce iron, and they found iron in other regions of Brazil, so the production increased. This photo is the ruins of an old colonial iron smelting furnace. So this was found by archaeologists. The sugarcane, of course, started also around 1530. They started producing sugarcane in the coastal area of Brazil. And at first, they used indigenous slaves as the predominant labor force, but it did not work well. Also, the experiment of plantation in general, in the world, the sugarcane plantation, the first ones using that system of intensive monoculture with African slaves, is started in the Canary and the Madeira Islands, the islands that are close to the coast of Africa. And those islands were dominated by the Spanish and the Portuguese. And it was there that they started the experiment of plantation. So they started to import African slaves that had that expertise, that had that experience in sugarcane plantation, and they start to use the same methods of that area to produce sugar in Brazil. So that idea that Barbados, for example, is the model for that the slave society or the sugarcane slave society is mistaken, because the production in Mexico was before Brazil, but Brazilian production was before the production of the West Indies. The production of sugar was used, the sugar was used to produce sugar, of course, the sugar cane, and cachaça, and was also because they have to eat. And so this was supported by production of food, which was very important. So we have beans and cassava, especially, and other things that they could, corn. And also they need bricks they made, they need tiles they made, they need iron, no, for nails. We already saw that they did it, and they need pottery. So you have, with that production, starting off a kind of a middle class, a class that was producing those type of things that were not enslaved, and start some kind of internal commerce, which was small. So at this point, we have sugarcane mining in this trading going on. So all the instruments for daily tasks, like all things made of iron, wood, or clay, or sisal, I think you say sisal or sisal, rope, and even soap. We have textile. Indigenous people already made textile, but African people made very good textile. So they had textile made for enslaved clothing, leather products also, bricks, and all other things for transportation. In the mining activities, you have the need of all those instruments that sugarcane production also have, and you have all these things, but plus the cattle raising, because to transport things and to feed people, you need that moment feed them with beef and pork and chicken. So that type of production is started together. There were areas, for example, there were people, especially the areas where they found gold, and they found gold around 1700. They, at the end of the 1600s, they already started to find minerals. And in that case, our efforts were put into mining, not in production of food. So they need to buy food. So you have regions like south of Brazil, which produced food, and they would go with donkeys, especially sometimes with cows, and transport those things up and down, so they could go and be the sellers. Some of those we call tropeiros, those traders that are mainly in the streets, they are going to create interposts, because these are long distance that take up over a year to cross with things, and they go around and they go and they buy things. So they create settlements. Those settlements, they would have pigs. They would grow pigs or chickens or some. So they trade on their way, or they trade coming back. They have places where they stop. So that was a circulation of merchandise that was creating routes of commerce, internal routes in Brazil. And then also those traders, some of them were also enslaved men. Black men were used and also managing those tradings, those routes of tradings. And how that could be, how would they, if they have the merchandise, if they have the animals, and even a fire gun, see? Why they don't just run away? Those slaves, although they are enslaved, they have power in the property. They are closer to the masters, and they have a position that was politically interesting for them. Many of them were very, let's say, loyal to their masters. And this was something that went through centuries. Another thing that changed in close in Brazil, the size of Brazil is huge. And from 1532, the colonial administration decided that in order to maintain the control, they need to establish some kind of political order in Brazil. So every village that was created, and in that case, an indigenous village, a tribal village that already existed there, could be transformed into a colonial village if the Jesuits, for example, the missionaries go there and build a church and start a school, so and attracted or have more indigenous people being brought, because some were captured and were brought to those areas, so that created a village. But from 1532, every village had to have a body of government that was made of one president, three, we call vereadores, like members of the parliament, one prosecutor, one justice clerk that we call escrivão, somebody that writes the document, one inspector, one judge nominated by the king, we call juiz de fora, which is somebody nominated from outside the village. So it's an outside guy that comes and is the authority there, and two judges that assist this judge, this major judge, that are elected by the assembly, the local assembly, and one person that is in charge of the jail. This is a lot of people. And guess what? In order to fill all this place, sometimes they didn't have enough white people. So they had to elect people that were mixed, people that could speak Portuguese, people that have some kind of authority in the region. So that created the Brazilian type of government, and you have less control the further you are from the shores of Brazil, the Atlantic shores, most likely that you don't have enough white people. This is a photo of what is a colonial village. So you see here the church. Here's probably a political area, some kind of political building, government building. And then you have the houses in a row. Sometimes you have this in the shores of the river or close to the ocean when you have a port. And this is, just to give you an example, Câmara Municipal, the building, it's like a mini parliament. This is from Rio de Janeiro, from Paraty, Rio de Janeiro. During the 18th century, which is from 1701 to 1800s, the economic development increased with sugarcane industry at this area here, especially at the shores. And then pecuaria, which is the cattle raising. People need to be fed, and you need more things made of leather, and also need the animals for transportation. And you have also at this point, they have found gold and diamonds in these areas in brown at the interior. That created lots of things. In this area here, which is the Amazon, they were starting the exploitation, the explorations and the exploitations through the rivers, finding what they call drugs. What are the drugs? Some kind of spices that they find there. The domestic production of cassava flour and other foods like dried beef, beans, salt, and condiments would support that. And besides this, we had a production of cotton and fabric for clothes, not for the rich. The rich could import from Europe, but you have middle and lower class and slaves that needed to be dressed. So in that case, in the indigenous people, they were brought into service. They all needed clothes, and those clothes were made in Brazil. The issue of international borders. So this was the size of Brazil around 1640. And Brazil was going to expand. How? Well, between 1580 and 1640, because of marriage and because Portugal did not produce a male heir that could be nominated the king, Portugal became united to Spain because of these questions of dynasties. They were related by marriage. During that period, the borders were not very, let's say, um, organized, so they could trespass without problem because it is one country. During that period also, Brazil expanded its territory and decided to go into the Amazon, which is around here. Also, it went south because right here in this entrance, there is a river called River de la Plata, and Brazil wanted to have access to this basin. So they started to have this expansion. After 1640, so they separated again. Portugal became one, and Spain becomes another different one. And there were some armed conflicts around the borders. Then they have an agreement in Madrid, signed in 1750, that was supposed to fix all the problems. And major problem was that Brazil decided to extend, I'm not saying invading because we are celebrating Brazil, so Brazil must be the good guy in our story. So Brazil decided to extend its domination through all the way to close to Argentina. It made sense because if you know the state of Rio Grande do Sul, for example, and if you know Uruguay, it looks more or less like the same kind of geographic region, but it was not like that. It was because they want to expand. So what they decided was that they want to create a fort, a fortified village close on the other side of the river. So you have Buenos Aires, the capital of Argentina, one side, and we are going to create another city on this side. And we are going to call our part Montevideo, which today is the capital of Uruguay. The government imported lots of people from the Canary Islands and the Madeira Islands to bring the population and start a village, not from the beginning, a big one already. Well, that movement did not go very well because they were going to start to expand and was a risk of they controlling the Plata River. And that was a political movement, an economic movement that did not went very well with Spain. Spain brought troops. There was a war. Negotiations. 30 years later, they signed an agreement. Brazil received part of that territory, which expanded the state of Rio Grande do Sul, and Spain got another part, which is today called Uruguay, the country of Uruguay. Brazilians can walk to Uruguay or drive to Uruguay. Brazil also, in that agreement, received part of today is Amapá in the north, Rondônia, and parts of Amazonas. So that is part of the expansion. And what Brazil did to guarantee the borders, because that's the idea, if you are the owner but you don't occupy, you are risking being invaded, they started to create fortresses close to the borders. And this is one of the fortresses that exists, the ruins of a fortress today between Brazil and Bolivia. It's called Fortress Príncipe da Beira. So we were expanding, and this is already passing the central area of South America. So we were expanding, and that was serious. The colonial expansion before 1750 and after 1750. So the Tordesillas Treaty was about here. By 1709, this was the map of Brazil. See, there are parts missing here. There are parts missing up here and here as well. 1750, we get something else around here. We get something else around here. So we started to expand. See how Brazil was becoming big and big and big? At that point, Brazil already producing lots of things. So all these stones here, so precious stones, plus gold, plus diamonds, these are diamonds, and silver, Brazil was producing. This was also a big deal. These countries, so every place that has these mines, they have also to have the local authorities. So I'll have these villages, the villages are expanding, the cameras are expanding, municipal cameras, more people are being imported from Africa, more and more and more to work in sugarcane or to work in the minings, more people being imported, more people being enslaved in Brazil, captured indigenous people and brought into the labor force. Again, first as slaves, second generation will be free, more people mixing, the population is growing. These are some images, drawings of they call the travelers' drawings about the Black people in the mining regions. Some African people, African slaves got their freedom because they could identify gold mines and they made their masters rich. And that was the agreement. Whoever find those things or find a big quantity of gold, they could then be awarded with their freedom. And that actually happened. So there were big changes in the 18th century. The discovery of gold and diamonds increased the importance of Brazil and the need for tight control over the mineral production by Portugal. So more villages were created in the interior of Brazil, more routes were created, more posts of inspection and place to pay your taxes, more taxes were introduced. Although higher authorities were Portuguese, the Brazilian elite, at that point, you have a Brazilian elite, they also participate in the political game. At the end of 18th century, there was so much gold and silver and precious stones coming from the Americas, not only from Brazil, but from Mexico, from Bolivia, from Peru, and also from Africa, which is not our topic here, but lots of minerals coming from Africa that created inflation. It was a flood of these minerals in Europe and created inflation. What comes with inflation? An economic crisis. So at the end of the 18th century, around 1770s, this inflation started to create problems in Europe, and Portugal decided to take some attitude, actually from 1750s, and demand more from Brazilian mining, because that was the idea. We have an economic crisis, maybe you bring more not money, more goods, you're gonna be better. Doesn't work very well. But they were pressured, they want more taxes to be paid by those who produced gold. More people were imported. So you have the supply of African slaves would increase more and more and more. The production of sugar in Brazil was also very important. A royal decree decided that all manufacturers would be closed in Brazil, and Brazilians would be forced to import everything that it was made in a factory from Portugal, and that did not end well. The idea was to expand Portuguese economy and to solve a problem in Portugal, but that created a problem for Brazilians, and that Brazilians did not like that at all. So in the same, if you ever learned the history of the United States, the same time England is pressuring the United States and putting more taxes because they also need more money to maintain their wars, and because there is a crisis in Europe. Similar thing is happening in France, and they were putting more pressure in Haiti. Things did not go well. A revolution in the United States, a revolution in Haiti. Remember that? So Brazil was also in a situation like that. This type of measures generated hate against the Portuguese and a nationalist sentiment among Brazilians. For example, they would say something like, why should I pay more for something made in Europe if ours is better quality and is cheaper? So that's the sentiment of Brazil. This is an image of what is São Paulo. São Paulo is the largest, the biggest city in South America, one of the largest cities in the world. And this is São Paulo in the 1700s. These are the area, so the church, and then you have the administration here. So the change continued to increase. The Portuguese enforced to enforce Portuguese rights over the frontiers, villages were established. Jesuits and missionaries were expelled from Brazil, and whatever was like indigenous settlements already in contact with the religious missionaries now were going to be transformed into a village, a colonial village with administrative building, school, and church. The languages of indigenous people were forbidden. Portuguese language was reinforced. This is an image of what would be a village managed by missionaries. And this is a drawing of a town, which is Cuiabá. It's a big city today. But this is a town that was built, a village that was built at the shores of a bigger river, a river called Cuiabá, which was very important for the transportation of gold. All this imposition of taxes started the ideas of rebellion in Brazil. Now, 1776, independence of the United States. News travel fast. 1789, French Revolution, right after it's going to start the problems in Haiti. But at this point, the French Revolution, many Brazilians go to study in Europe and they would learn about that. In 1789, a few months after the French Revolution, in Brazil, we had a plot to create an independence, but not the entire Brazil. They want the independence only for the area of the mines, we call Minas Gerais, that produced gold and diamonds. They want that area to be independent. Of course, for that area to be independent, they need to take a piece of the coastal zone, because they are in the interior and they need to have a way out to the ocean. So they need a piece of Rio de Janeiro, for example. Their plans were made by the elite. There were some people that were not from the elite that participate on that, especially from the middle ranking of the army. But their plans for independence never included abolition of slavery. 10 years later, you have another plan in Bahia, and that was also about all the impositions that the Portuguese were creating and all the rules. But that was the Rebelião dos Alfaiates, which translates into the Taylor's Revolution. And there you have mulattoes and blacks and poor whites participating in that. Those plans for independence also only for the state of Bahia, or the province of Bahia. At that time they were provinces. That involved abolition of slavery. That was the only one. Both plans were defeated, never created a big revolution, a big fight. But the idea of independence was there. So things were getting more complicated. I'm coming to the end of our story. In 1808, remember, Brazil became independent in 1822. In 1808, there was a war going on in Europe. In Napoleon, remember that guy with the funny hat, with the hand inside his coat? Napoleon invaded the Iberian Peninsula, which is the place where you have Spain and Portugal. In Spain, they invaded Spain first because Spain is closer to France, and they imprisoned the king, and Napoleon nominated his own brother king of Spain. Now, Napoleon is coming in the direction of Portugal. Napoleon wants to control that peninsula because Napoleon is in a war against England, and he wants to control that peninsula so he could control the Mediterranean Sea and that part of the Atlantic. And so the British is coming on the one way, the French is coming another way, and Portugal, which is a very small country in Europe, is in the middle. And the Portuguese regent, his mother is an old lady, the queen. He didn't want to go in prison. He didn't want to lose his throne, his crown. So they make an arrangement with the British to run away with the protection of the Navy, the British Navy, to get to Brazil. And he gets to Brazil. Now, if you ever watch that old film, what's the name of that film? Airplane, Air Force One. Air Force One, in which the guy, when he saves the president, and the president has to go to another airplane, he says, now this is Airplane One. We become Airplane One. So wherever is the president, that is the place where the airplane is, okay? Wherever is the king, that is the headquarters of the kingdom. And the royal family arrived in Brazil. And when I say the royal family, it's not mother and father, 2 dogs and a cat. I'm talking about the extended family. I'm talking about all the royals they could put in several ships, because it was not only one ship, that arrived in Rio and created a big turmoil in Rio, whatever. We're not going to go there. But once they put their little foot in Brazil, first in Salvador and then in Rio, guess what? Brazil is not a colony anymore. Bow. No more colony. But we are not celebrating independence yet. Hold. We had a flag and everything. Are you kidding? We even had a flag. And this is the flag of the United Kingdom of Brazil, Portugal, and Algarves. See? This is Unido. Business becomes better than usual. Brazil now is the headquarters of the kingdom, of the empire, the Portuguese empire. First, need to open the ports. Forget about that idea of mercantilism and the Portuguese would control the port, because Portuguese is in Brazil, so Brazil controls the port and the trade. Well, there are not many people to trade with. There was 2 wars going on, one in Haiti, one in France, whatever, but they trade with British. So there is this trading. The urbanization of Rio de Janeiro, of course, the royal family is there, so they need buildings, they need gardens, they need big boulevards and so on, because the royal family needs to walk around. They need all the new buildings because they are going to create the royal mint to make money in Brazil. So now we get the gold, and the gold don't go to Portugal anymore. It stays in Brazil, and we create the mint. Bank of Brazil, we are making our own coins. The royal press now have kind of a newspaper and books. And also, Brazil received lots of refugees from their wars that were going on in Europe, Napoleon Wars. Came lots of scientists, botanists, medical doctors, philosophers, lots of intellectuals. Yeah, that's why we have lots of drawings, because some artists came as well. And all of this, we're going to open a Royal Academy of Fine Arts. Can you believe that? We need to open the industries again. First industry, gunpowder, because in case of the war comes to our shores, we need to fight. Second, very important, industries of iron. So we are back to business in increasing the exploitation of iron, the mineral in Brazil. They opened two two schools of medicine, one in Rio de Janeiro, one in Salvador, the Royal Military Academy, which is engineering, and the Academy of Arts. So the university system was organized later on in the 1930s, but tertiary education, so we already had in that time. This is the Botanic Gardens. They imported some Chinese people to help with the construction. This is the picture of the Royal Iron Forge, the place where they were making iron, one of the big ones, the major ones, which is in São Paulo state. And the war is coming to an end. At the end of the war, people of Portugal that resisted Napoleon stay in place, and they organized a government, like a parallel government. And now they ask the king to go back. And they say, you come back, Brazil goes back to become a colony again. And we don't talk anything about, so everything goes back to the same place, or we are going to take you out and we are going to declare ourselves independent and we are going to become a republic like they did in Brazil, or sorry, in the United States or in France. In that point, there's not many kings, and so over in South America, life is not very, the king misses all the movement in Europe, but also Portugal has control over places like Goa in India, in places in Japan, places in China, and all the areas of Africa that the Portuguese Empire has. So the king at this point, Dom João, decides to go back to Portugal. Okay. Well, he delayed and delayed and delayed, and then he decided to go. A few years later, say, okay, I'm going. He goes. He calls this guy here, his son, Pedro, and all Brazilians who are my age learn that in school and see the film, because you are forced to, in which the king call his son and tell him basically, look, Pedro, this is going to end bad. Brazil is going to separate from Portugal pretty soon, because he knows this is 1820s. Everybody's separating, becoming independent. Mexico is already independent, in war for independence, but it's on its way to become independent. Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru. So you have it. They are all becoming independent. Independence is coming. So be alert. I'm going to leave you here. And if you see the things is coming, the occasion arises, take the crown and put in your own head. I already have you as the king of Brazil, then to have you expelled, and then we lose control over everything. All right, done. What happened? 1822, the courts, the parliament in Portugal were trying to force Pedro to go back to Portugal, because with Pedro here, okay, here now, I'm not in Brazil, I'm Barbados. With Pedro in Brazil, Brazil could not be taken back to the situation of a colony. But Brazil still have this situation in which is not a colony, it is not the headquarters of the kingdom. What is that? They don't want the story of United Kingdom. So they pushed and pushed and pushed, and the Brazilian elite also pushed back because they did not want to go back to the colonial situation. In 7th of September, 1822, Pedro decides and signs the papers and sends a letter renouncing his crown in Portugal and declaring Brazil independent. And this is our flag of the Brazilian Empire, who start then. End of part 1. There we go, independent at last. Thank you very much. Wow, time. Ping.
Yes, well done. Okay, thank you very much, Elaine. This was very interesting. I hope we learned a lot. I learned a few things that I didn't know, so it was a good session for me as well. I would like now to open to the public and ask if someone has a comment or some question to ask. So feel free. The floor is open. Does someone have a question or wants to comment something regarding this presentation?
Hey, good evening.
Yes, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Hey, so Dr. Rocha, was this the only time in history where a colony um became the where I should say actually housed the entire royal family and the kingdom actually moved?
Yes. The only time, the only place. See how unique the Brazilians are?
Thank you, thank you.
Okay.
I remember when I learned that before. I wasn't sure if I had learned that it was the only place, but listening to it again and getting the refresher, it's really interesting. That's the only place that ever happened.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Darren. Other members, the audience would like to ask or comment something? Yes, Marcia.
Marcus, I would like to know why we don't speak the Portuguese like the Portugal people, seeing that we were actually the Portuguese, they were there, and why we speak a different Portuguese. Why?
I will
That's a
refer to you.
yeah.
That's a
That is
question
a
for
very
Marco.
that is a very good question, and I'm planning to do a session before we end this series on the Portuguese language and the history of the Portuguese language in Brazil. There are several reasons, and I would need more time than 2 minutes to explain that. So we will have a session where I will explain why the Portuguese language of Brazil or the Brazilian Portuguese is so different from the Portuguese spoken by the Portuguese. So this is also a reason why you should come back and watch our series in the future, because we will have a session dedicated to that. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
But I would add just a hint because no, in Barbados you don't speak English like in England as well, and without miscegenation also is a cultural miscegenation. So you have words in Portuguese, Brazilian Portuguese that are of indigenous origins, and we have words that are from African origins, for example, but the way that we speak also is determined by the region, and Marco is going to explain that.
Yes, I'll make a little joke here. Actually, as a linguist, I shouldn't make this joke, but I will prove that the Brazilian version of Portuguese is a more developed version when I make my presentation. No, every every language is different, of course, and every language has its own properties. This is not; it's just a joke. Uh,
I
but uh, but the variety and the development of Brazilian Portuguese is very interesting, and we will dedicate a session to that. Okay.
Thank you, Marcus. Thank you,
You're
Elaine.
welcome. Anyone else would like to comment or ask something? Yes, Leonora.
I just wanted to say thank you, Dr. Hosha, for taking the time to make this presentation. Your presentations are always so well planned and very informative and full of information. So I just wanted to say thanks.
Pleasure.
Anyone else? No? Okay, so I take Leonora's words and I thank you, Elaine, for being here and for taking the time and explaining uh, the, the period before Brazil's independence and what led to Brazil's independence. As I said, on the 7th of September, which is a Wednesday, actually not a Thursday, we'll have a special session because that is the day of Brazil's independence, and we will dedicate more time to that, and we will dedicate more time to the period after the independence as well. And I'm sure Dr. Rocha will come back to explain us more things in other sections, okay? So next week, I will present and I will talk about Brazilian football. Okay, so the session next week will be on football. As usual, it will be in the WhatsApp group chat. I will announce it on Wednesday, and that's it from us today. I say boa noite, good night, have a good night, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Boa noite.
Boa noite. Obrigada.
Até.
Até.